I always wondered, why do they use Latin for magic in Harry Potter? It just didn't make any sense to me. So, Latin, as you may know, was the language of the Roman Empire. In Harry Potter, people speak English, or whatever the local language is, when they talk to each other normally, but use Latin when they're casting a magic spell. The magic words are in Latin. So this brings up many questions. Is Latin just a magical language? If you just learn to speak Latin, are you going to make magical things happen just by talking? In the Harry Potter universe, they imply that their magical society has existed since ancient times, more or less intact, implying also that they've been using Latin as their magical language the whole time. So, were they speaking Latin to use magic in ancient Rome when it was the normal everyday language? And if not, what was the magical language then? Okay, so let's come back to that. Let's talk about why fiction writers use Latin for magic words. First of all, it's not just Harry Potter. It's also Ben 10, comic books, stage magicians, old books and movies where people use magic. It's everywhere. But why do people think Latin equals magic? So we know Latin was the language of the Roman Empire, but why would that make it the language of magic? Well, it all started with the fall of the Roman Empire. You see, the Roman Empire became the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and they gave all their services, the masses, in Latin. And over time, the common people didn't speak Latin anymore. It was only used by the priests, the church, during Mass or religious rituals. So, to peasants in the Middle Ages, Latin sounded strange and mysterious, and priests using Latin magic words seemed like magicians. They could use Latin to do things that really seemed to alter reality. Marriage, baptism, last rites, absolution, excommunication, turning wafers into the body of Christ, keeping the devil at bay. Latin users, seemed really powerful. Then, as the Middle Ages became the Renaissance, Latin became the language of education. Books on scholarly subjects were usually written in Latin. Medicine, science. That's why even today, plants and animals have scientific names that are in Latin. Latin was only used by Catholic priests and the educated elite. To common people, they all sounded like magicians. It sounded like English, but it wasn't. It was some ancient, dead language. So common people, they associated religion and books with the supernatural, the mystical. That's why wizards in storybooks have spell books, because that's representing educated people getting information out of books. And so to common people, it just seemed like magic came from books. Well, in the 1600s, the early stage magicians, who were really more like crowd magicians, they took advantage of all the superstition. They would do tricks, and they would say, hocus pocus, when they do a trick. Hocus pocus, like they were doing magic words. But they were just copying what they'd heard priests say and not even saying it right. They were saying, hoc est corpus meum, which means, this is my body. The priests would say that during Mass, during the communion. And The common people didn't know any different. It sounded like a magic word to them. And it helped establish Latin, or something that sounded like Latin, as the language of magic. And that tradition carried through into the modern day with stage magicians and fiction writers. Okay, so that's why they do it. Now let's look at Harry Potter again. So in the Harry Potter universe, they go into a little more depth than a stage magician. There's a universe with some history to it. Now, Rowling wanted to convey that her magical society was ancient, but history didn't begin with the Roman Empire. Now, whether or not they were using Latin for magic in the Roman Empire in that universe, let's not worry about that right now. But what did they do before that? They weren't speaking Latin before the Roman Empire, so what were they speaking? Well, maybe what happened was the magic-using people in the Harry Potter universe were each speaking their own language, their own magical language, before the Romans. And the Romans imposed Latin on them, just like in the real world, that the Romans would conquer people and then impose Latin on them. Well, maybe the same is true in the Harry Potter universe, that they would conquer magical people and make them use Latin as their magical language. So, what did they speak before that? Well, in real life, who did the Romans conquer? They conquered the Jewish people. They conquered the Celtic people. So maybe before the Roman Empire, magic-using people were speaking Celtic. And, there's a lot of folklore about Celtic or Irish magic. I mean, think about Samhain. That's Halloween, and that's very magical. They were conquered. We know that the Celtic people were conquered by Romans. So that would make a lot of sense if that were a language that people used for magic before Latin. And Hebrew would make a lot of sense too, because they were people who existed already and were kind of conquered by the Romans. And Hebrew has been associated with magic, so you could, that would work in the fictional universe of Harry Potter. Stories like the Golem, where they wrote a word in Hebrew on the Golem's forehead, which brought it to life. So there's an association with magic words in Hebrew, so that would work. Or Romany, the language of the Gypsies, that would work. They're associated with magic, so fortune-telling, tarot cards, crystal balls. So there's an association of them being people who were conquered or people who were not the people who were dominant. And then you could have Greek. Greek would work really well as the language that was the language of education and scholarship before Latin, because it was in the real world. So it would make sense. It's the language of mythology, so a lot of mythological creatures, griffins and hippogriffs, those come from Greek, so that would work. Now, people in the ancient world, they thought that magic came from the Persians, and there were lots of ancient spell books, quote-unquote spell books, in Akkadian. So anything like that, Babylonian, Sumerian, the ancient Persians. So that would work, being before Latin as a magical language. And of course, Egyptian definitely would work. That would have been very widespread in ancient times. Anyway, that's why they use Latin in Harry Potter for magic. All right. Thank you. Bye.